Hi everybody, I'm Amanda and I'm an early childhood educator facilitator with the Durham District School Board.
And I'm Diane, and I'm also an EC facilitator with Durham District School Board.
Today we are doing episode 2 of the Early Years podcast, and it's all about pedagogical documentation. So Diane, what are we discussing today?
So we're going to try to unpack pedagogical documentation a bit, Amanda. We know that in Ontario the kindergarten program changed back in 2010, and we're really moving away from only a product-only assessment format to gathering information of children's thinking and learning in a variety of contexts, in a variety of ways, and then using that documentation to drive our practice forward. So pedagogical documentation.
Yeah, and I think we also want to touch on a little bit of how we can maximize technology when we're doing our documentation, and how we're going to connect that documentation on how we report to the families within our classroom community.
Love that. The purpose of pedagogical documentation is it's about gathering and analyzing children's thinking and learning over time. What this means is instead of me looking in and thinking, oh, I think that child's doing this, I can enter in with prompting questions and really begin to glean information from the child about what it is they're thinking or what it is they're working on and learning in that time.
Yeah, so we want to use that information to guide our practice and plan for the learning that is taking place within our classroom. So we want to meet the children at their learning, identify those gaps, and make our next steps see that growth in learning through our documentation.
Love that. And really, the growth and learning is the piece that once you have a baseline, those are the pieces that you want to be gathering the information on. So we'll talk about that, unpack that a little bit further as we go.
Yeah, and we really want to make sure that when we're doing our pedagogical documentation, like you said, we want to involve the children in that assessment loop, but not only the children, we want to involve the families too. And the kindergarten program is explicit in making sure that we are asking families what learning is also taking place at the home so that we can take those into consideration when we're doing our documentation.
I think that's a really key piece of it. We want to be engaging the families, and sometimes children are shy or unable to show us things at school, and families play that huge part of the triad of who really impacts a child's life.
Yeah.
So when we look at this, the pedagogical documentation protocol, we really want to look at the description of what's happening and sort of think around I or we see this happening, we heard this happening. So we're really in description mode. That's a very literal observation of what's happening so that the child is moving all the blue manipulatives together and all the red manipulatives together in another pile instead of saying the child is sorting, because that would be my presumption that the child is sorting when in fact they might not have that word yet and they might be thinking about other things. So being in description is entirely just that observation of you're seeing something, some kind of learning or thinking is happening in the classroom. Then when we move into interpretation, that's when we start to attach a curriculum expectation to it. So in the case where a child has a pile of red and a pile of blue, for example, I might assume that the child is sorting. Perhaps they're not at a sorting skill yet, and they're still at matching, which would come before sorting. And so that's when I start to add an interpretation to that. When I saw this, I thought it meant that. And so that's when we're entering in with prompting questions and really beginning to find out what it is the child's thinking. And so we can have those conversations with the child, find out where they are at the edge of their learning, and through our own knowledge be able to continue to extend that learning with the children.
Yeah, and when we're asking our students those prompting questions, maybe they're not able to name the learning that is taking place right at that moment. And that's when you can come in as an educator and talk about how you see them sorting and naming the learning that is happening for them, because sometimes they just don't have that language yet to be able to explain the thinking that they have and the thinking that they're having behind the learning that you are seeing in front of you.
Absolutely, and this really gives us a platform for, perhaps I've set up a provocation, let's say around sorting again, and I come to the table as I see children working, and I say to them, oh, tell me what it is that you're doing, what are you playing with those math manipulatives? And they might say, well, I'm making them into a pattern. Well, that might not have been the goal for that table, but it might still be a concept that a child is exploring. So we can have those conversations around that work, and then if it's appropriate, bring them back to goals of what's happening. It's about differentiating learning for all the children.
So once you've described your documentation, you've interpreted, now it's time to think about the implications for practice. So how and will you know where to go next with the learning through looking at the documentation that you've taken?
Yes, so if we're really allowing the children to reveal to us the curriculum that they're working on, then that allows us to use our professional judgment and find where we think maybe the gaps are in learning, or where that child is in the trajectory of their learning, so that we can meet them at their point of learning. We know that everybody is an individual in how they grow and learn, and so this allows us to better plan purposefully and target children if we need explicit instruction or something that we're working on. It really comes back to the intentionality of what it is that you're doing. But to simply gather information and put it in a repository, that's really just collecting documentation. To make it pedagogical documentation, you really want it to drive your practice forward and be including the families and the children in the work that you're doing.
In the Ontario Kindergarten Program, we have a great quote on page 37 that says, documentation is of limited value if it is not used to gain further insight into children's thinking and learning and to determine where to go next in learning. So if we are using the iPads we have in our classroom to take great pictures of students with their work, what are we using those pictures for? And we have to really rethink how we're documenting and what's its use going to be to you within its practice. So for the purpose of this podcast, we're going to be discussing the who, what, where, how, when, and whys of documenting within the kindergarten classroom.
I think that's a really great point, because I think that when, and feedback that I've had from educators is that when they started to read Making Children's Thinking and Learning Visible and document the children's learning, it kind of took on a life of its own, and Making Children's Thinking and Learning Visible became put it up on the wall. But really, that's even just about in the moment, in a notice and name, revealing curriculum to the child and concepts that they're working on. That is making it visible to them, to us, to their peers around them.
So we want this podcast to be a great time for self-reflection. We don't want you to change all your practices right now around documentation, but we want to take this as a starting point to think about how you document and what you can improve upon to make your life easier and to help guide your practice. So if you're doing documentation in a pedagogical manner, it'll help you plan what you're doing this afternoon or tomorrow, where your students are now, where you want them to go. It's a repository of growth and learning. You're tracking the children's growth and learning, which will be more evident over time for you. And this is what you're going to be reporting on for our kindergarten communication of learning. So if you're doing proper pedagogical documentation throughout your kindergarten classroom, it's just going to make your life so much easier as you go along.
And I think that everybody who's found that magical key, and we know that it takes a long time for people to lean into how this gets pretty precise for them, but everyone who is has found sort of that way of collecting information and using it to drive their practice, then report that when the time comes for writing the communication of learning, they really are just at picking a child's key learning, because they already have all the evidence of growth and learning, and they've even been writing next steps to help to promote learning to continue to move forward. So really, it's a little bit like doing the work in small pieces over time so that it's ready for you.
So it's not so overwhelming when you go to
Yes.
write your communication of learning. You don't feel like you have to rethink everything that you've already been doing in the classroom. This is things that you're already doing throughout the day, but you're just taking the time to make sure that you're documenting it properly so that that information is available to you when you need it.
I think that it is learning, not really a new way, but shifting how we do what we've always done to incorporate other pieces so that we're reflecting the whole child.
So our first question is, who is documenting children's learning?
So in the kindergarten classrooms here in Durham District School Board, the early childhood educator would be documenting, the teacher in the classroom, the teaching partner. If there's prep teachers that are coming in, they would certainly be able to contribute to the documentation, as well as we can be having information from the children's peers even, and their families included in our documentation.
And the next step is, now that you know who's documenting, what are you going to be documenting? And you have to really start thinking about what you're documenting. Are you taking pictures? And if so, what is the purpose of this picture at this time? So is this a picture that you want to send home to families from an app? Is it to keep for your end of the year slideshow? Or is it to really document your child's the child's growth and learning? And if it is to document the child's growth and learning, how are you going to connect it to the kindergarten program? And how is that piece of evidence helping you plan for the child's future learning?
Absolutely, and I think that when we look at all the things we do in our classrooms all day long, every day, we can anchor that, everything, right into the kindergarten program. So I had a colleague share with me a really great story around sort of the what it is that you're collecting. She shared a personal story about her grandmother who was a real shutterbug. Grandma loved to take photographs at family events and really liked to collect and archive the memories of the families. So sadly, when grandmother passed away and they were sorting through her personal items, they came upon many photo albums full of great photographs that had been taken over the years. And remembering that this was a while ago when you took pictures and then you had everything developed, there were bags upon bags of cast-off photos that grandma had decided not to include in the photo albums. So why I share all of that with you is because my colleague who shared this story with me said that as they were looking at the cast-off photos, they kept asking, why did grandma take this picture? What is even happening in this picture? So that's a piece. If you are taking photos and other people can't look at it and see the learning, then really consider what it is you're taking a picture of. And like you said, Amanda, sometimes the kids are like, look at my pretty hair, can you send this to my mom? Or, look at the work I just did for the 12th time in 3 days. Can you send this to my family? Sure, I can do that. But if that's why you're taking the photo and keeping it, then fantastic. But if you're taking the photo because this is a baseline of where you think your children are in their learning, or this shows growth in their learning, that's a different story.
Yeah, and you have to document that part of it too, and the growth and learning that you're seeing within that picture, so that anybody looking at that documentation can understand what is happening.
Absolutely. And so, for example, if you had a child who was patterning AB, for example, you don't need 12 photos of AB patterns that the children have collected, or have created, rather. But when that child moves into an AAB, or can explicitly identify the core of that pattern, or is changing it up to pattern within different attributes, those are all growth from the basic AB pattern. Those are the pieces that you want to keep in your repository. It doesn't mean you can't take 12 photographs of a child patterning, but you might leave those on your iPad and not put them, for example, into a OneNote document if that's what you're using to collect and keep what you are keeping.
So the next part of documenting that we wanted to talk about is, where are you documenting student learning? Is it only happening at a guided table when you're one-on-one with a student? Or is it happening in other places? So if we're thinking of students as curious, capable, and competent learners, and your classroom is set up with all these rich learning opportunities, your learning should be just happening everywhere. It's inside, outside, in the gym, and we definitely don't want it just to be paper tasks that are used for assessment purposes. It's documenting, and learning can happen throughout the day, everywhere, anywhere in the learning environments that we've created.
Completely agreed, and I agree with you that we're not looking for just product documentation, like you're saying, paper tasks. But I think that this is a shift away from I'm recognizing learning because I'm in a teaching mode and you're in a learning mode, as opposed to shifting into we're co-learners and I'm able to assess in the moment. Oh, you know, we all get to know our kids over the time of the year, and oh, I know that you didn't know that before, or listen to these different concepts, or look at that interaction you're having with that person that I haven't seen before. This shows a shift and a change in what it is that's happening, so that we can continue to document those kind of things.
The next part, when we're thinking about documentation in our kindergarten classrooms, is how are we going to gather the evidence of children's thinking and learning? What tools are you using? So we were talking about how ideally this would be a shared system between all educators, something that everybody can access, and it would be something that you would figure out that works best for the teaching team that is involved in the classroom. So there's lots of different ways that you can do this, and some of the ways that we've found educators have been using is Brightspace or OneNote. These are programs that the DDSB specifically likes for us to use.
The reason for that, Amanda, is that they're supported by our tech department. So, for example, let's say January rolls around and our system here crashes, and you've documented everything in OneNote. Our tech department here at DDSB would work towards getting that put back together so that you would be able to recover the documentation that you have. However, other apps that are out there in the world, which, you know, I'll leave unnamed, they have limited approvals in our system, meaning that they're owned privately, and if they're ever sold, there's no guarantee of continued privacy. And let's say they're sold at the end of this year, and you go to work on your communication of learning in January, and all of your documentation from 4 months is gone, then this is sort of that FYI, our tech department will not be helping you. So it's just a nudge to remind you that if you're going to be investing that much work in what it is you're doing, to choose a supported platform might be something you'd like to consider.
Yeah. And if you're not listening to us from within the DDSB, maybe that is something that you want to look into if you're working for a different school board, or if you're in the United States and you work for a different district. What is supported by your tech department, or what is supported by your school, so that you know what would be the best tools that are at your disposal. And it might be something you don't even know about yet, and it could be a great tool that you could have access to. So these are all just things that we want you to consider when you're picking that tool, and find the best one that's for you. And if it does end up being a paper and pencil way, just make sure it is accessible to everybody, and that when you're writing your assessment notes, that it's something that other people can also read. Yeah. And if you are a DDSB educator, there are some resources that are available to you on the portal, and we'll make sure we link those in the show notes so that you're able to take a look at those if you're interested.
Fantastic. So when are we documenting? And when can be throughout the day. Something might happen first thing in the morning, it might happen at snack time, it might happen during the walk to the library, at any number of times. It might happen at carpet time, at guided table, at a provocation. Really, I think what I'm trying to say is it can happen from when the children arrive until the children leave every day.
Yeah, and one of the problems that we tend to run into is we don't have time throughout the day always to be able to grab something and take a picture, but we want to make sure that we're trying our best to make that time available to do documentation, because it is so important and so vital to guiding our practice. So if you are going to be using an iPad for your documentation or some kind of like electronic device, there are voice to text systems that you can use that make documenting a lot easier, and just making sure that we're taking that time throughout the day when the children are in their learning, and to just makes it easier to document their growth. So you're not thinking about it afterwards when the children aren't there. It's easier to do it when they're in the classroom and they're doing that learning.
And I think that if we've been able to relieve people of some of what they're grabbing, like I've got to document, so I'm just going to take pictures. Instead, there's more intentionality and more purpose to it. So if I'm really excited about a photograph that I've just taken, maybe then I want to sit with the child and take that opportunity to walk them through an assessment loop here too. Wow, we're going to keep this information that shows what you've learned, and you can have student voice incorporated there. And I get it. Kindergarten classes are really busy, and we're often busy, keeping all the balls in the air, if you will. But when we're able to facilitate a kind of learning that really engages students, this hopefully then helps to free up time and to have those conversations, and sometimes courageous conversations in our full-day kindergarten classes here in Ontario, would look like, if you're doing this and you've got all of the children for 10 minutes, that does then give me 10 minutes that I might go into doing some of the, documentation that we're working on.
Yeah. And the last question we're going to ask ourselves today around documentation is, why are you documenting? So if it's true pedagogical documentation, we're using it to inform our practice. We want to plan our next steps in learning. We want to engage and involve families. We want to be able to give descriptive feedback and do goal setting with each of the children. We want to also be able to track their growth in learning, and it's also to be used to conference with team partners and just make sure we're all on the same page. So if you're doing some great pedagogical documentation, in the end, it's really just going to make your life easier. You're going to be able to plan your next steps, plan what you're doing this week or next week in your classroom so much easier, because you can see it. You can see where you need to go next.
Yes, and I think previously, sort of old thinking, if you will, was that I could plan an entire year, and on a day that I seemingly arbitrarily decide we're going to learn this, that becomes that day for that learning. Instead, we're recognizing that we have this span of time and that we're sort of exploring these concepts all the time, recognizing that young children practice skills over and over again until they've reached mastery, means that you might have moved into exploring measurement, but a child is still sorting and measuring with it. And so being able to see those very clear links in curriculum expectations and being able to notice and name what is happening in that time will help to get us sort of into that mind frame of being a co-learner with the children and recognizing their learning when it happens.
Yeah, so that's the shift that's been happening, and the shift that happened when we moved into full-day kindergarten in Ontario was that the learning isn't happening in a silo, and it's not just happening at a prescribed time when we decide that learning is taking place. We're recognizing that the learning is happening all the time in all the different places within our learning community, and so we're not just documenting the children's thinking and learning about what we think they're learning either. We're making sure that we're asking them and having their input into what they think they're learning too. So I think this is a big shift that has happened with how we're documenting and what we're documenting within the kindergarten program. And I think it's an important one that we really need to self-reflect on and make sure that we're providing best practice for our students.
Absolutely. And I really quickly just want to share a story with you, Amanda, about being in the classroom. And as I was learning the beginning steps of learning around pedagogical documentation, my then teaching partner and I, we had taken so many pictures and we were documenting because we hadn't really unpacked it well yet. And so I had had some of this learning, and I came back into the classroom, and one of my little guys one day was, he was stacking tubes. And as he was stacking these tubes, he was pushing them together. So I thought he was practicing stability. But you see how I just jumped from interpretation to description. And so, or rather backwards, from description to interpretation. Mm-hmm. So the description is that he was stacking the tubes, and the interpretation by me was that he was practicing stability. So as I went over to chat with him, I heard in my head, what is it that you see, what is it that you hear, and ask it prompting question. So instead of saying, hey, I see you're practicing stability, I said to the little guy, can you tell me what it is you're working on? And he said, I want to measure my friends. And so knowing this little one, had I said to him stability, I entirely could have shut him down. And instead, we took this great time to measure all of his friends against his tower. And over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, I was able to learn that when he found a child who was the same height as his tower, he still identified the child as taller than his tower because he didn't have the words same and equal. So we found that gap in his oral language and his understanding of these math concepts, and that changed what happened in the coming days. So I didn't take pictures of all of the children being measured. I took pictures of some really relevant pieces and put that into his documentation so that a few weeks later, when he was still working on the concept of equal, it still wasn't there. And so that as a JK person, we were able to decide whether or not that beginning skill was enough or if we were going to take some time to explicitly teach it. That's the value of taking the time to really engage with the children and learn what it is. If I'd have said stability, I could have shut him down. I might have never known he didn't have same and equal. We had been practicing it and working with it for a while. So it's just a slow down, really see what's happening intentionally in your classroom.
Mm-hmm. And we're not even saying that you can't take those pictures of the group of children working with the cylinders and save that for your end of the year slideshow. Parents love this kind of stuff, and we don't want to stop taking those pictures for the other purposes that we may have within our classroom of communicating with parents and creating a classroom community with other kinds of pictures. Mm-hmm. But we just have to realize that that's not necessarily the documentation that we're looking for when we are looking for the growth and learning, when we're planning for next steps. Yes. Though that's just a different kind of documentation. Yes. That's just a kind of documentation that we can use for our end of the year slideshows or to put on classroom blogs or send to families. So it's just that thinking about pedagogical documentation and making sure we are doing it intentionally and having that intentionality behind it.
I completely agree.
That was episode 2 of the Early Years podcast. We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode about pedagogical documentation. If you did, I hope you will follow us. We will be putting out episodes on the first and third Thursday of every month. And we are going to be having a speech and language pathologist come and speak to us about oral language. And we're very excited to have her. She is so knowledgeable and has so many amazing ideas and so much amazing learning to share with us. So we look forward to having that in the next few weeks for you. And if you are on social media, we have a Twitter and an Instagram. You can follow us at DDSB Early Years on those 2 platforms. We will see you next time.
Thanks.